Should be up. All right. Well, hopefully it's gonna kick in. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So, all right. Cool. I'm gonna keep it on the side just in case. So welcome everyone. My name is Enpremi. I use this as my sort of online avatar. Otherwise, my name is Adam. I currently work as a visual media specialist at an engineering company where I do visualizations for them, which sounds super unexciting, but it's a quite a fun technical work where I do real-time visualizations. I've been part of Rise of Mordor modding team in the 2015 to 2000, maybe 17, 18 years. On this page, I've got my portfolio where I've kept my reasonable pieces because that's something that sort of I would like to do down the road professionally. So I don't like to keep bad pieces on the portfolio. That's something for you to consider as well, is whether you want to do this only as a hobby, on the side, or whether it's something that you actually enjoy and you like to pursue. And that's going to determine a lot of how you approach projects and individual units. Over here I've got some blog as well, where I cover, for example, the first 2 steps that I did for the Lannister armor. So I encourage you to read through it. I try to keep it somewhat specific, useful, little bit technical as well, because I think there's on YouTube you'll find basic coverage for everything. So I'm trying to do this sort of semi advanced steps, which you wouldn't usually find. One of my work has been recently featured on Epic's blog, so that's sort of a little bit for my accreditation to sort of prove that I know what I'm talking about in terms of technical expertise as well as art to an extent. I've got a YouTube channel where I just post quick demos that I do from time to time. I don't really do tutorials since those tend to be like really time consuming. So I thought that this would be a great idea when I saw earlier that you guys were wondering how I did certain things. And so I decided this would be an opportunity to reach out and sort of give back to the community. So let's get to some of the questions that I have. The general workflow is usually, if it's a really organic object, something like a troll, that's quite a niche example, but those I recommend starting with a high poly. Normally I start with a low poly. The software that I use is I start with a max. I know there's loads of you guys that are using Blender, and I'm absolutely fine with that. One of the things with digital art or art in general is to differentiate between I think it's like transferable skills and non-transferable skills. Transferable skills is actually the art. It's the thing that what things should look like, regardless of what tools are using. And then you have the sort of the non-transferable skills, which is the actual software that you use, the tools that you use to create your art. The reason why I mentioned that is you can have all the tools that you want at your disposal, but if you don't have the transferable skills, it's not gonna help you. So I work in Max as my sort of major primary modeling tool, but I'm pretty sure the Blender can do all of that stuff. Same goes with high poly sculpting. There I use Zbrush, and I know that Blender's got some sculpting tools as well. I haven't played with Blender myself too much because I simply really do not have the time to relearn. I would love to start with Blender because I'm not a big fan of Autodesk and their approach to software. But it's just something that I grew up using, so it's too big of a part of me to suddenly relearn. It's kind of like learn to write with your left hand if you're right-handed, or vice versa. So Zbrush is definitely a Swiss Army knife of 3D tools. It's incredibly complex, and if you're not familiar with it, it's going to be overwhelming. I would recommend, if you're gonna take this, I want to say somewhat seriously, I would recommend you look into Zbrush, because it's gonna make your life easier. It's not gonna be a magic trick which will allow you to suddenly create amazing sculpts. That comes with time, because that's a transferable skill. But it is a little bit more flexible tool. It's really customizable. If you need help with getting access to this software, ping me a message on Discord and I'll see what I can do. So yeah, I usually start with a low poly. I think the best example would be to probably take a look at the Uruguay assets. So when we bring this up, rising art. So that one started with a chainmail. I remember there was a chainmail specific question. So I'll try to cover that first, because that one's quite interesting. Let's see which one's which. One thing to also know is your projects will tend to get quite large. And so if you plan on taking, once again, this thing, kind of long term, and you want to do this down the road, try to keep your files for as long as possible, and maybe invest into some storage. But yeah, here we go. So this is the mesh that I've used for the chainmail for the Isengard units. One thing to know is this was used. This was created using nanomesh, which is a sort of procedural placement. And if I look around, you will definitely know that there are some visual discrepancies in terms of size. Obviously, you're gonna get stretching with any kind of procedural placement. The only way you would probably not get stretching is if you're using your placement mesh, which is what it's using this for. Is you have a, let me see if I still have it somewhere. So this is my placement mesh to an extent, which is a really low poly mesh that I then sort of subdivide a little bit more to get somewhat evenly spaced faces, and every single face is going to get assigned a mesh, which in this case are the links. But that obviously means that if your face underneath is a different scale, it's gonna get stretched. So you cannot really get rid of stretching when it comes to patterns like these. The goal is to fight the battles in a way where you can get away with it. So for example, with the chainmail in here, I know I can get away with, let me hide this guy again, that I can get with stretching underneath armpit, for example. I can get away with stretching probably somewhere below, figure out what are you likely to see and what you're not likely to see. And that is going to determine your priorities. In terms of characters, the main focus will likely be the upper body. And then you go down from there. You're not likely to see, someone's foot. Hands, yeah, probably, because that's where weapons are. But the focus otherwise will be somewhere else. It's usually heads, helmets, so that's how I determine priorities, and it really dictates everything from the amount of detail to UV, texture, all this kind of stuff goes from there. So yeah, I don't want to go too much in detail on how I made these things, because obviously this is now tool specific, and if you're not familiar with ZBrush, the vast majority of this will go over your head. But obviously, if you guys would like to, then I can go into more detail into it. But the general rule is, don't be too concerned with the stretching. And if that's the case, just try to move things around with the placement mesh, because I think that's how the vast majority of other tools will work. One of the things that I obviously did is, when you get this procedurally created mesh, it will look really fake, artificial, because it's procedural. That's kind of the point of it. So what you want to do is just break it apart a little bit, give it a little bit of a real touch. So what I just did, I just went and I randomly dragged out links, especially around the edges, sometimes in the middle, and I just dragged it out and deleted them to give that little bit of a realistic sense. Another thing to point out with surfaces like chainmail is, when it comes to baking, you need to have a back face mesh. So I think this is the actual mesh that I used for baking for the low poly, which should technically cover the entire surface of the chainmail. But if I were to just use the chainmail as my high poly and then the yellow surface as my low poly, what is going to happen is the rays, when they're baked, they're going to go through and they're going to keep going, and they're going to hit the other side. So it's going to give you inaccurate result, where the links on the other side are going to clip through. So what you want to do is you want to bring in a back face mesh, which in this case is just a mesh that is fully closed off, that is going to stop the rays from going through and hitting whatever is on the other side. I've given this vertex colors. So in these cases, I usually use vertex colors for my alpha masks for opacity. So in this case, anything black would be obviously would be transparent. Anything white would be opaque. So yeah, so that's how I do the chainmail in terms of texturing. I think I've textured this back in Quixel. I think I've started with a sort of rough iron variant, and then made some a little bit more copperish and bronzish variants, just in case. One of the things that I think High on T asked, is there something that I would do differently today? So it's always great to keep your old artwork present, and for you to go back, because you can see the progress that you've made. My first units that I've made for Rise of Mordor were Dale assets, and they are really bad. I mean, they kind of hold up to an extent, but I think back then I haven't really done any sculpting. All of my normals and textures were sort of hand painted. So let me see if I can find that. 3D. So I've decided to sculpt down the line because I decided to learn how to do sculpting. But before that, I would have to hand paint my normals using Andu, which used to be a plugin for Photoshop. So I could get decent results with it, but you know, it's not really appealing nowadays. There are many things wrong with this. But in the end, it kind of worked out. This was my introduction into Attila, into their material shaders, and also into the variation system. So one of the things that I kept in mind, let's see if I can open up a file where I would have all of them. So when I was making these assets, I knew I wanna be able to mix up the individual parts. So I had to think in a modular approach. So let's see if we can fire up Max and open up some of these files to show you what I mean. I think certain factions like Mordor, what else? I don't know, maybe Gondor to an extent, and anything that you know will be relying on variants for its sort of major flavor. You want to think about how you're going to create these assets so they can fit together nicely, and you can swap them around without causing any clipping issues. So let's see. If anyone has any question in the chat, guys, let me know. By the way, I'm trying to keep an eye on the QA on the YouTube chat as well. But obviously, if I miss something, then it would be great if someone just figures it out while I do this kind of thing, so I can answer these questions. So these should be the two different variants. And let me see if I can sort of highlight what I mean. I think those two are the same meshes. So that's not a great example. Oh no, it's the same asset, damn it. Never hidden. Anyway, the point I was trying to make, and I failed, was to show that both of these armors, so it's this one and this one, they both end in the same way, so that I can modularly attach different gloves to them. Same for the boots, for example, and the cloak. So I wanted to be able to swap any of these amongst each other without having any clipping issues, and therefore sort of enable the variants to sort of, you know, you can end up with a lot more in the end. So yeah, this was the first stuff that I was creating, and it's I think this was done back in 2015. So we've gone quite a long way. But it's definitely good for you to always look back. Always look back. So we cover the chainmail. With every single project that I was doing, especially for Rise of Mordor, I always tried a different workflow, and that meant that sometimes you can't really transfer the skills that you've learned, but you know which way not to go. So it was kind of figuring out the best way to approach, let's say, clothing. It took me a while to learn Marvelous, and still nowadays I'm not super efficient with it. I'm gonna throw a quick example on the screen, where I use the where I started creating the Galadrim armor, and I unfortunately didn't get very far with it. And so let's see. So the Galadrim armor is pretty sort of complex. It's a pretty complex model in the end. In terms of the parts, right? I initially thought that I could just start with the base body and maybe sculpt the individual leather layers in. But I decided, you know, why not try to do it entirely in Marmoset, in Marvelous. So I had some reference and saw that, well, this kind of looks like just a bunch of layers sort of sewn together at the edges. When it comes to reference, I do try to stick to anything that Bella produces, but obviously you come into issues where, for example, you don't really know what it looks like from the back, and you have to rely on really questionable pictures. So don't be afraid to use your own creativity and just sort of imagine what it should probably look like. But yeah, in this case, I just decided to go sort of nuts with it, and I broke it apart into individual layers, which are stitched together. I think they should have actual individual layers in this case. So when they are being stitched, they sort of lay on top of each other. But yeah, I didn't get really far with this. I would say that I would probably still continue with this approach if I was doing it today. I think it was definitely a learning experience, and if I was to do it today, I would still go by the same way and see how far I can get with it. Simply because it's just the most accurate approach that you're gonna get when it comes to fabric. Let's open up a little bit more practical example. I think there was a couple questions regarding the Lannister armor, which hopefully I should be able to show. So how many of you folks are using Marvelous? Just as a sort of point of reference, like is there anyone who knows about it but is sort of, I don't want to say afraid to use it, but it just, you feel like it's not necessary, or that you can maybe get away with it, you know, just try to use something else. I know that Blender, once again, uses some clothing simulation, and to be perfectly honest, Marvelous has a lot of flaws. It's initially designed as quite literally a software made for fashion designers. So it at the beginning didn't really have tools for 3D artists, but nowadays you can get quite a lot with it. So yeah, so this is a good example of how far you can push Marvelous and how really helpful it can be once you start get your gist around it. When I was creating the gloves for the Lannister armor, there wasn't a lot of reference for that, and I thought, you know, do I really need to make gloves to be super specific? And I came to the conclusion probably not. It would be much better for me to just replicate gloves that I have at home. So what I did, I just took my leather gloves that I have at home, and I literally just tore them apart, and I used them to create the guide, to create the pieces individual design in Marvelous, and then I used that to sort of stitch it around the hand. and actually gave me a pretty decent result. Obviously have some problems where you have pinching, so that, and obviously you need to set up your fold angles. I think if you go and select, there we go, select your fold angles so that you can end up with these sort of curved edges. So that's obviously a way to improve this kind of approach. And every single time you sort of do something new, challenging, in a way, you will be way more confident the next time you do it. So definitely do not be afraid to just try something, and you know, it doesn't always work, because when I started with the Lannister armor, with the clothing, I had bunch of unsuccessful attempts at it. So if we open up, let's open up. Oh, that's a new one. So let's see. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let me drop it back on. So it should be fine. So are you referring to the edges themselves, or what specifically do you have in mind? This piece. Oh yeah, this. So I think this is just a. I think this is an internal line. So when you have an edge selected, I think if you have two, no, you do it this way: offset as internal line, which allows you to kind of create a new one in, and then you can use something called, I think it's called seam tapping. I bet it's gonna break it now, but that's fine. But you can kind of have your separate pieces, or your separate sort of individual parts, and you can create lines in between them, same as when we look at the bottom, and I have this sort of sewn effect where technically there should be stitches going in between, which create pressure and hold the fabric together. They pull that way. That's achieved by this sort of internal line, which then has elastic enabled, right, which sort of pulls the fabric close together, and it can give you this kind of result. I think the similar approach was the camera control. I think similar approach was used on the seam on this side, but I think in this case I use something called seam tapping. I think I don't remember all these tools in here, but that one allows you to select an edge. Seam tapping, there you go. So you select an edge, and it will give you an option to kind of flatten that edge or keep it as flat as possible, which could give you sort of like a trim effect, so that the fabric doesn't deform with like fine details. It will still maintain the major sort of collision and the big folds, but the tertiary detail folds that you would get from stuff like elastic or things being sewn together, it tries to eliminate it and kind of flatten that. So that's certainly a way to do that effect. Yep. I was going to quickly show you the other parts of the garment. So I think this section went through many layers of iteration. One of the things that I wasn't sure back then was, what does it look like at the lower layers? You know, what does the gambeson look like? What does the shirt look like? So I had to kind of use some imagination. I think this was the first example that I tried to go with. I had an idea what the skirt should be, but it always ended up looking absolutely awful. So in the end, I just decided to, I think, just split this and simulate it as a separate skirt. So if I got the renders somewhere. I think it's this mid layer. Yeah. So I just ended up creating it as a separate skirt that you sort of put on as just a gambeson skirt, because from the reference it would always be shirt on the lower layers, so it wouldn't be an entirely gambeson sort of body, which was a little bit surprising, but that's sort of how it is. I think the scarf in this part was the most challenging. I don't think I actually use this mesh. I think the scarf is the worst part of this model, because I was too lazy with that section. But if you want to do scarves or anything where you know your fabric is going to fold, I really recommend you sort of look into freezing. So let me see if we freeze everything but the scarf. Okay. So if I simulate, hopefully it's going to kick in eventually. One of the things, depending on which Marvelous version you have, you should be able to use GPU simulation, which is way faster. So right now the response is okay-ish, but you'll struggle to get fine detail in, and just again some sort of finer actions movements will not really replicate nicely. So let me see if I can do it back. On the left, you should be able to, if you hold down, you can toggle between different ones. If you do it by the standard one, that one is using your CPU. It is more precise than your GPU calculation, but it's way slower. And I think it's okay if you try to do like a very fine detail, because of its precision, or if you're using lower density mesh. But yeah, that one just uses different algorithms to run. So if you switch from between those two, you might end up with weird effects from time to time. So that's just something that I think it's worth mentioning. But most of the time I use my GPU simulation because it's just faster, obviously depending on your GPU. But regardless, it should be faster. The only problem is it takes a while sometimes to kick in. That's one of the things that I haven't really figured out. Why does it take so long for the simulation to kick in? I'm pretty sure it's got something to do with the amount of points that are in the scene. So maybe instead of freezing, you might want to hide things. But yeah, the reason that I mentioned that is I wanted to highlight the benefit of being able to like freeze certain parts, which you can use as sort of anchor points and move them around at one point. Obviously, you have to be careful with those to not move too fast, because if you do, then the collision detection just messes up and you get this. And this, unfortunately, is super difficult to get back up, because the moment you start dragging things back to where they should be, you're gonna have a bad time. So yeah, you have to be very slow with that. And the way you would get to that state, if it ever gets me, let's see if we reset this. It's miles away. I think there's this option called pin, which allows you to pin either on the 3D surface or on the 2D, and every single time you create, you drag and you create a selection, it's gonna create a new group, meaning that when you then click on it, you will be able to see if we simulate. Yeah, you'll be able to select it and move that entire group. And because that side, the edge was created before, that's a separate group that you can move around. So this is a good way to sort of place things where you want them to be, and help you with the placement. I know someone was asking about tacking on avatar. That thing is, so yep, go ahead. Oh yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. If you need help with updating, again, ping me a message, and I should be able to sort out newer version. But yeah, attacking on avatar is usually pretty tricky, because it depends on you have to have your size set up accurately, because it determines the overall collision. So I think if you select that avatar, I think somewhere over there it has, in the scene, possibly set for some offset, skin offset. I think that's the ones that determine the collision, so how far it goes away from it. But I don't know how often do I use stick on avatar. It really depends on the case by case basis. I prefer to just freeze parts or pin them in place, because that way I can move it around a little bit more freely. But yeah, I think that should sort of be it. If we, so yeah, this was an earlier version of the garment, the lower layers. I think the boots over here were sort of an interesting part, because they have a hard bottom, which I sort of set up at the beginning, where I just outlined the top and the bottom, and I give it a little bit of a thickness manually in here with the strip, and I froze that. I created an internal, I again selected the edge and created an internal line, which allowed me to stitch both of those two patterns to it without deforming the solid part at the bottom. So so that's a way to go about these kind of assets, because there is no way to get a rigid fabric from the assets, unfortunately. And that goes for all kinds of props that you would have, that you'd be using around. But yeah, if you have any further questions with Marvelous, let me know. Yeah, that's a good question. So it once again depends on how far you want to push it. I usually recommend the higher the better, because you can always go below. You can always merge vertices, but you can't really create new ones. Same with textures. But I think in the blog actually I cover this section where Marvelous now has its own retopology, where you can retopologize directly onto the 2D pattern, which is useful. The only problems are edges, seams, where you have to kind of figure out where the points should align. So that one's useful because it automatically snaps to the surface. In terms of the amount of the topology definition, I think for most cases is actually best if you keep it flat. Again, for a game like Attila, you don't want to go too high with retopologizing individual folds. The folds are really tricky because the moment you start following them is the moment you will break up your edge flow. In other words, you obviously an arm geometry should be just bunch of loops, like a one big cylinder that just follows the shape. Now that is going to be messed up the moment you start to follow the edges. If we open up this image, we should be able to sort of maybe not. Yeah, you can sort of see how it starts to deform. So this was the subdivision 1, which I created in Marvelous, and then I chucked it into one level higher. So this is the topology that I'm using in the sort of final low poly, and it actually does follow the folds to an extent, but you get some problems with baking where it doesn't give you the best results because it tries to follow the folds, but it's a really low poly mesh, so it's gonna give you some janky results, especially if you don't fix triangulation. So every let's say put on the actual example. So every face has a if it's a quad, it needs to be a triangle for any kind of engine to render it. What that means that if it's a flat surface, it doesn't matter which way the diagonal line is created, because it's not going to result in anything different. Where you're going to have issues is if it's sort of an uneven face. So hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate a little bit better on an example. So this is a retopology from Marvelous, and one of the things that you have, I think it's going to be visible on this guy. So by default, this face would probably think that it should be, if we retriangulate, where's the button? There we go. No, it's smart. So if we turn on sort of triangulation visibility, so as you can see, every single face has is split into a triangle, and sometimes that is not going to follow your topology. So as you can see, if I flip it in the wrong way, I'm going to get a tooth, or yeah, it's just going to create peaks instead of trying to follow the line. And obviously the software has no idea when the mesh is created, or if you use any kind of automation, it has no idea which way you want these to be facing, and if it's not done properly, then you can end up with these kind of jagged edges along the silhouette. It's going to work fine if you look at it from like directly perpendicular, but the moment you start to look around the edge, you will start to see it sort of peeking through and really looking jagged, and wishing you just baked it down like I bake it at the lower section, where I don't bother with it. because I know it's going to be covered by further assets. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you're doing retopology for fabric surfaces. Yep. Yeah. If one of the later projects that I was doing after this, I actually used Maya for retopology because it has a specific plugin for it. It's a really sort of specific scenario. I'll see if I can fire it up. Probably the best approach in terms of software is try to limit how many steps you have to do in terms of software. So obviously that's why Blender is kind of great, is because you can do your low poly, you can do your UV, you can do your retopology, technically high poly as well within one package. Because the moment you have to start making jumps between softwares, you might have to run into issues with different units, right? If one software is working with inches and the one is working with standard metric, centimeters, meters, millimeters, you're gonna have problems if you don't catch this while you're exporting or importing, because then when you decide to bake it, they might be different sizes, and you will have to redo the steps of figuring out how much you have to scale things up and down. But yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. I was never really a fan of retopologizing in Zbrush or in 3ds Max. So if I do retopology, I do it, I think, usually in Maya, or I start with the low poly in a way that I know I'll be able to use it as my sort of final low poly in the end. So let's just follow with this before I jump back to it. So one of the things that I was doing a couple of months ago was there we go. Mouth of Sauron for the Bannerlord mod. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, for sure. So let me just one thing, if you don't like retopology, as probably the vast majority of population that has to do any kind of 3D work, I do recommend maybe looking into Maya, because Maya has a really intuitive sort of retopology tool, and it can handle quite a bit in terms of the high poly. Plus, it's way better at creating UV than 3ds Max, but that really sort of depends on what you're used to. I think you can really do anything with either Max or Blender. But yeah, this tunic, for example, was retopologized in Maya because I just wanted to experiment with something new. And I find Maya to be sort of the most intuitive workflow. So rigging, I'm gonna put rigging a little bit down the line. But okay, let's open up a model where I think this would be the case. I think Isengard is probably a good example. So I think the case with skinning tunics, especially with the lower armor, if you don't have bones for the actual skirt, which in Attila you don't, that's where your topology becomes really useful. So in here I try to stick to sort of having decent edge flow. Like obviously in certain sections I just do not follow. I'm not exactly sure why this is such a mess in here. But or this, for example, I don't know why this is split in here. That makes no sense. So when you have that, you can sort of easily go from why isn't it showing up? Yeah, you can sort of easily go from an edge loop. You can loop it, and then you can start to grow things, for example, and using this to do blending, which will start to smooth the endpoint, both of the endpoints, to create a more smoother result. But usually I just rig it to the thigh instead of trying to sort of have some influence from the lower bones, from the calves, simply because it really creates you unwanted results. And I would rather have occasional clipping when quite often the units are crouched. The units are crouched, and the skirt would start to clip through legs, and I would find it way more acceptable for it to go through the calf rather than trying to bend with the calf, and then do the same thing in the front when the unit is running. So that's just the case of which it's kind of pick your poison, right? Which one is the least worst option? So there is no easy option for this, unfortunately. But while I'm here, I think it would be good to cover some of the variants that I was making for the Urughai. Let's see, this is a mess, but we should be able to make sense out of it. So I did know that I'm gonna make some mixing up with the Urughai to give them sense of variation. We have skin on. So I split them up to an extent where I knew they would be able to be merged together. And for example, I then created the spikes for the Berserker helmet to create the Stormers, which was just the case of reusing assets, reusing UV space. Same thing with the braces, where you have variants on either left side or right side, and then you combine them both, or you have just gloves. All of this will help you, in addition with color variation, will help you to break it apart and have some reasonable and optimized variation amongst your units. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, so you mean if it's like two-sided? So I think for that it's kind of tricky. Because yeah, the default Attila shader doesn't render it as two-sided. So I think for this case it would be best if you you skin one side first, let's say I would want to make this two-sided. So I would skin this top side first. I create a copy of it. I would get it to get rid of the skin information. Get rid of the section of the mesh that I know I won't need to have two-sided. You can flip faces, and you can kind of do skin wrap from here. But I think what's a little better is if you offset it by a tiny bit. So in this case, in Max, it's called push modifier, which pushes the vertices by their normals. So it kind of pushes it in or out. So I push it just a little bit in, which gives it a gap, but at least it will give it a little bit more leeway when it comes to clipping. So go back to that. Skin wrap, get the information from here, with all points, convert the skin. So hopefully this should give us, when we select the bone, yeah, this should sort of deform it nicely. So you don't have, so that's kind of the approach that I would go. Now, you can definitely see over here that I have problems with this kind of approach. But this is just something that I have to accept, right? I know they'll be clipping with the way that it's optimized. Keep in mind that one vertex can only be affected by 2 bones chocks. I'm not sure now. I think it's either 2 or 3, but I want to say it's 2. It's just doing that for optimization purposes. Otherwise, it would be too expensive, which is really difficult to preview in Max, or I would say probably even Blender, where you can't really go and tell the software, do not use more than 2 bones per vertex. So that's probably one of the reasons why sometimes you will get different results from your modeling software to what it looks like in game. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. I'm just gonna take a quick break. I'm gonna have a glass of water and I'll be back in a minute. Alright, I apologize for that. So one of the things I would like to point out that wasn't really asked, but I think it's pretty important, is UVs, because the UVs are going to determine how much you can get out of your texture. Now I'm not sure if I've done it well on my archive, but I'm just going to get a quick look and see if there is anything glaringly wrong with my UVs. It doesn't seem to be that bad. So let's take a look at this mesh. supposed to look like. So I try to optimize the UV as much as possible. The goal is to fill up as much space as you can, which sometimes means rescaling individual elements. There is one case where it's not a good idea to do it, and that's when you know you'll be applying a pattern to it. So in the case of, let's say, a shirt, you don't want to scale up things individually too much. Right, there can be like a 5% discrepancy. But if you know you're gonna have a pattern on it, you know, fabric pattern or any kind of other patterns that you'll be applying in your texturing package, you don't want them to scale up too much. If you're using UV projection, if you're using triplanar projection, that's fine, right? Because it's using your 3D space to then convert it into 2D, so that's fine in that case. But for most of the time, I just scale things up as much as possible to fill up all the space that I can. One of the things that I see quite often is when you have trims of on armor. So let's say stuff like this. By default, when you try to relax the UV, you're gonna run into issues with let's see, if I select this and I relax this as much as possible. Where's my hand tool? There we go. So I can't tell you which one is better. I can tell you which one is gonna get you more pixels. So one of the things that is probably worth mentioning. So I'm just gonna cover that. When you baking, your smoothing groups or normals are gonna determine the cage, and that cage is gonna capture the high poly in a way, and that is gonna determine what your edges are gonna look like. So there's a bunch of pictures that sort of explain this, but I'll just do it in a nutshell. So let's say this is my low poly, and I'm gonna create a high poly out of this and give it chamfered edges so that I get nice smooth edges, which I should bake down. Bake this down, chamfers only, smooth. So we have two objects, one that has smooth edges, one that has just sort of hard edges, which is my low poly. I want to bake this information down onto the low poly one. If your UV on the low poly would be your typical sort of phase by every smoothing group, or every sort of normal island will be a separate UV island, you're gonna have pretty much perfect results when it comes to baking edges, right? So let's say if I decide to unwrap this as if it was like a paper box that you have to put together using glue. So something like this, where it's all one solid piece. When it comes to these edges where they are connected, because they have different smoothing groups, so the vertex normals on those are split, you're not gonna get good sort of baking results, because it will fight which pixel is supposed to be there. simply because they're both facing in a separate direction, so the cage will split. But there is a finite amount of pixels. So even though your high poly has a smooth edge over here, your low poly will actually have a really weird edge going along this seam. So and I recommend to sort of split up meshes into separate smoothing groups, giving it sort of different normals in here, because I'm not sure what it's called in Blender. So that means that if you then go, I'll send the picture over, which should explain it better. So that means that these faces have different smoothing groups, and therefore they need to be different UV islands. The reason why is that is because otherwise you're gonna get weird errors on your bakes, on normals, on curvature. I think AO will be fine, but anything else probably fine as well. But the most important two, normals and curvature, will just give you wrong results. Which, you know, if the closest you'll see the unit is probably something like this, doesn't matter. The moment you want to do anything more detailed, it's better to have the best practice. So hopefully that sort of answers your question. And the reason why I like to split those parts from the sort of by smoothing groups, right? So by hard normals, is it allows me to separate them and maximize the UV. It's gonna be way better to sort of lay smaller pieces together than larger sort of multi-shaped pieces. So this is kind of a pain in the ass to fit things around this. If it is even bigger, it's gonna be even more complicated. Whereas if you actually isolate it, what you can do is you can then straighten those out. So this is like a fully relaxed UV island. If I do it with all of them, they're gonna get all kinds of shapes. Now, trying to organize this is going to be a nightmare, right? Trying to stack this is just an absolute pain to fit anywhere. So what I recommend to do, I'm not sure what's the workflow like in Blender UV editor, but I imagine there's going to be a similar tool where you select those and you use the straighten edges, and the same for the other axis, and you just kind of do it for all of them. And so sure thing is you're gonna get distortion. So if I bring in angle distortion preview, you will see that I get stretching on the trims. I get stretching on even bigger faces because I decided to straighten these sections as well. But that's kind of what I want anyway. For one thing, this is absolutely tiny on the model, right? It's a freaking thickness edge. You're very unlikely to see it. You will definitely see if it's not there. So if it doesn't have a shell and it's just sort of like a plane, it doesn't look the best. So to an extent, you want it to have a thickness, but the thickness in terms of texture size is not that important. So you're sort of fine with distorting it that way. The only thing that you're sort of sacrificing at that stage by detaching it is if you're applying a pattern to it or a material in your texturing package, is it's not gonna follow over the edge, which is a price I'm willing to pay, because once again it's kind of a minor part of the model. Plus if you're using trioplanar projection, that takes care of it. So it's once again picking your battles. I've straightened out these leather straps as well. So I think if I were to select them and relax them, they're going to give me a twisted part at the end, because obviously they're shaped that way, and that's fine. But once again, I'm trying to keep things as straight as possible where I can, because they're way easier to stack, and I can maximize the UV space that way. Plus, quite often it will sort of make sense, because the fabric by default should be straight, right? It should be a straight leather strap in reality, and therefore it's sort of bending and stretching, and it is going to bend and stretch that texture in a somewhat realistic way. So that's a useful thing to do, if you can get away with it. Like in this case, I've assigned the edges to the same section as well, simply because I know this is going to be straight, and there is no point for me to separate it somewhere else. I just want it to be one part of it, so it's easier to fit. Whereas if this main body had its edges attached to it on the UV, again, it's a very unfriendly shape, which is just going to extend even further, making it more complicated for me down the line. So this is a definitely useful thing to do with your UV, and it definitely helps for when you're applying patterns. So one of the things to keep in mind is when you're doing your UVs is, are there any patterns going to be applied to this? So if I open up, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, are you doing that in Substance? Are you texturing in Substance? Mm-hmm. So that could be many things. So this is Max. I have an earlier version of Max, so this is not the one that I would be using for Attila export. But in there's a bunch of sort of tick boxes. I don't know if I have Max 15 still around. 14 is the one that I'm using. Nope, I don't have Max around anymore. So that one, and there's like a tick box in the material shader when you're exporting out of Max, which is which should be able to sort of preview it. One thing to note is to double check that your TGA that you're applying to the mesh in the shader in Max has an alpha channel. So if I jump back to the Isengard model, what would be a good one? Skin armor. Yeah. Oh, that's bizarre. Because I was hoping he was going to record that. But thank you for pointing it out. Alright, well, that's a shame. I'm not exactly sure how to fix it, unfortunately. But, yeah, apologies for that. Okay. So, yeah, I would say double check that your TGAs that you export, that they have the alpha channel in them. So I'm not sure if you have Photoshop installed, or even XNView. Right, XNView can can preview that kind of stuff. So this one obviously doesn't have which. I'm trying to find a texture that would have a TGA that would have assigned. But yeah, so those would be my 2 points to check. Otherwise, check what are your export settings. What are your export settings for the material in Substance? That's the word. So I think maybe this flag will have it. Nope, this is really bad. So the chainmail texture definitely will have it. So there should be a texture that has it. Again, that's one of the things when you have those old files, everything has different names. Yeah, just check that it has an alpha channel once you export it out as TGA, and then check it in Max in the shader that the has alpha channel or something like that is ticked on. Otherwise, I'm not sure what would be the issue there. But yeah, I was just going to briefly mention the UV just for one last time. Reduction. Yeah. Go ahead. So, what's the next question? Oh yeah, I remember that problem. I know there was a specific file, specific skeleton that was used for rigging hands, for rigging gloves. I am not sure if that one is floating around still, but I can have a look because I know that I had to export my gloves separately, because otherwise they would have that sort of weird. The moment you would assign it in the tweak viewer, in the variation, where you put variations together and you can actually preview your assets, they would have like messed up fingers. It would be like collapsed and everything. So I know there was a separate file for that. I think if we look in, let's say, God, maybe is that the one? Yeah, I have a separate file for exporting gloves, so I can send it over to you. As long as, does it say which max file this is? No. So yeah, I think as long as you have like max 15, or 14, I'm not sure now. Okay, yeah, then you'll be more than fine. Yeah, so you should be able to open this file and use that as your skin wrap sort of source, and you'll be able to yeah, do that. It's a bit of a pain, but it's one of the things that just happens with modding. I'm not sure if this was a problem with other games as well from CA, but I know that this was definitely an issue with Attila, and Jogs managed to find a model that had good hand skin. So yeah. So yeah, this is just one thing to note for when you're setting up your UVs, and you know you'll be applying a pattern to it. Assign or orient it in a way so that it follows it the way you want. So in this case, if I were to have stripes going from left to right, then they would be following it from side, from sort of shoulder to arm on the shirt. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. Also, when you will be applying fabric patterns, so patterns that I have. Let's see if I open up. It's not gonna die on me. Send. So this is the Mouth of Sauron. One thing that to point out in terms of software, I'm sort of starting to finalize which toolkit I like. Recently, I know that Jogs has made a together with Vickers, they've sort of finalized a plugin for Substance so that you can export out textures according to the Attila shader. So that's definitely a useful thing. But you know, if you ever decide to take a different route and try to go into different engines, I do recommend looking into Marmoset Toolback. First thing, it has amazing baking tools. It's one of the few softwares that is using GPU baking instead of CPU, which makes baking way faster. And you also have the control of sort of, you can do your own, sort of paint your own cages. I'll probably just drop down the link. It's a pricey software. I think it's like 250 quid now. But it's great for baking and it's also great for texturing. So it's just something to point out. But one of the things I wanted to mention with fabric is, if you know you'll be applying a pattern to it, what I like to do, I generally like to break up the parts, so that way it makes way more sense for it to not align, right? Because if it was to align perfectly in here, it kind of looks artificial, and it sort of breaks the immersion of realism. Because realistically, right, there would be two separate sheets of fabric just sewn together, made out of like a bigger piece. So the fact that they would align is highly unlikely. So that was just sort of a thing to point out when you're doing patterns and this kind of stuff with UVs. So probably someone was asking about priorities in terms of texture size as well. One thing to say on that is, definitely when you are creating your low poly model, when you're retopologizing, or when you're sculpting, and especially when you're texturing and doing bakes, go as high as you can. Don't be afraid to use 4K textures for your raw production, so for when you're doing texturing, because you can always export it at a lower resolution. You can always shrink it down. You can always scale up vertices, right? So you can always reduce the poly count, but you can't really go the other way around. Sure, you can add some new edge loops, but you might mess up your normals. You might again distort the textures quite a bit, and for textures you just simply cannot really go up. You can use some AI software to upscale the textures, but it's not gonna look good. So I highly recommend, if you know that your in-game textures are going to be 1K, bake them and texture them at 2K. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no worries. Happy to help. All right, you two, take care. So, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, hello. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, so should you extra yeah, so how much detail should you put into the low poly geometry? Um yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So for that, it's usually the case of, so first of all, what is your budget, your polygon budget, right? So you will want to sort of fit into that budget. But secondly, silhouette. In other words, what can you see from angles if you just hide that? Shadows obviously play a role as well, because obviously you're not gonna get shadows from a flat surface. You're not gonna get shadows from normals. Obviously, the normals are gonna help you to fake the illusion of the shadow, but you might not be able to get away with it um too much. So if we look at this, so this is just with the normal assigned to it. The reason I have this edge loop over here for the extruded armor is because I know there might be cases of where I see it from the side. So the best thing to sort of evaluate this is if we look at this, use environment background. Let's see if I can give it a black backdrop. Let me see which is the button that I'm looking for. There we go, 8. So let's give it a black background so that you know what I'm talking about. And then I'm just gonna assign. Okay. So what I was trying to show is obviously what does it look like when you just going for the silhouette? In other words, only the edges. And what are the likely chances you're gonna see things from side? Or again, how likely are you going to see this specific mesh from a different angle than face on? It's usually case by case. For game like Attila, I think you can get away. You can get away with quite a bit just baking down, but generally, it does help to just sort of export out or extrude out certain faces to break it apart. You know, you have to be careful with how far do you export it, because if it's just a flat surface and then all of a sudden there is a single edge, it might break it apart a bit too much. But other than that, I think if you use Modly, you can get away with just that. I'm thinking if there is, like over here on the shoulder pads, technically there shouldn't be one extra edge loop over here, but I decided to do it that way because it sort of does help out with the normals. There might be cases where I see it from an angle like this and I just want to have that pointy end over there, otherwise it's super smooth. So hopefully that sort of helps to answer that question to an extent. Yeah, good. Probably one thing to mention when I was doing the Lannister armor, because it's quite a hard surface, even though there's a lot of, I think the better term would be man-made, is I knew I want to have a decent topology for my high poly model. So I started, in this case, I started in max, where I created a low poly, and I wanted to get proportions accurate as early as possible, because if I were to take this into a sculpting software and I did some changes to it in terms of proportions, I would be sort of screwed, because I'm trying to avoid as much manual retopology as possible. So that's something to sort of point out, is just see, sort of plan in advance. And if you have a good base that you then can use for your high poly, because I just take this into Zbrush and I can retopologize it automatically over there to give it an even topology for good sculpting, and sculpt the details on that. I don't then have to do and retopologize the entire thing, right? I then have to just go back and maybe move faces here and there, because this thing has subdivision on it, so I can go over here. So this is the basic model that I started with. It's a really primitive plane, and the simpler it is, the easier it is to start adding subdivisions and creating a smooth surface. So in the end, for the sort of final model that I'll be using to bake information, I'm probably using like a second subdivision, because it's just somewhere in that area of a decent, sort of decent enough topology where things are smooth, but they are not like unnecessarily smooth, right? So if I were to look at the edge over here and see the difference between this, well, I'm starting to see faces in here, especially when I start to look from other angles. Like I can see pointy angles. But if I start to etch, if I start to add faces, iterations for subdivision, the first one smooths a lot of it out, right? I'm doubling the amount of steps in between, but another one is probably way too much. So that's kind of the rule, is just try to find the middle ground of is the next step too much, right? Can I actually see the difference in the silhouette or not? If you don't, you just reduce the size. It's especially useful with round objects. If I find my Ravanian regions and I open up the max file there, because over there it's a round object, right? Cylindrical objects kind of tricky to retopologize to bake down, because it's really tempting to kind of go low with the low poly mesh, just kind of hoping, yeah, well, it's gonna bake down, right? It's gonna be fine. But the problem is you're gonna get some weird results, because it's just the way you're trying to bake a curved surface onto a flat surface. That works only if you're gonna look at it perpendicular. If it's like a side view, it's gonna break. So what I do with these kind of situations, if I go into performance, I quite literally, I think in this case I probably could have gotten, because this was made 2016, probably couldn't get away with quite literally just collapsing even these faces sorry, these edges. So you just keep the edges themselves quite high poly. But the next step, you're starting to merge faces, and it doesn't, you know, it's not, you're not gonna save a bunch of faces. Again, still quite high up, but it is an optimization process which will allow you to save on some of the budget. And then if someone then judges this and looks at the wireframe, they will sort of be able to tell that, oh yeah, this person sort of knows what they're doing in terms of topology. They know what's optimal or not. The only time this wouldn't be applicable if you know this is going to be a rigged topology, because then you're breaking the edge loops and you won't be able to just quickly go and, like I sort of showed earlier, where you can select an edge loop and you can grow from there and select each separate edge loops and smooth them or blend them out, because you just break the edge flow. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. Oh Jesus, yeah. Again, super high. This could have been way lower in terms of topology. Now that I look at it, quite often what happens is when you have your symmetry seam, it's good to ask yourself, do I really need that seam there as well? Once I'm done with the topology, like can I get away? In this case, I can't get away with this face, but I could definitely get with this seam over here, because it doesn't need to be. It doesn't really need to be here, because it's just a flat face. Let me just double check the list of the questions. As for the detail, like someone was asking on the Lannister armor, let's see if I can open that up. It's not in here, so let's see. Oh yeah. Yes, that would be the workflow. I'll see if I can find out the max file for the pauldron, because that should be somewhere here. Pauldron retopo. So this should be the optimized retopology. And at the same time, let's see if we can open up. I'm not sure why this thing is here, but maybe that's the one. So this is just for the color face. Let's see. So in this scenario, for these edge pieces, I think I did actually use the low poly one that I brought into Zbrush, which I then sort of made sculpt friendly and sculpted a detail on it, and then just went back and adjusted some of those faces to fit the shape a little bit better. I think this entire face, this entire structure for this pauldron was manually retopologized in Maya, because it's a pretty intricate shape, right? Trying to retopologize sphere is kind of a problem. But yeah, in terms of UV, for example, for this, just to sort of bring it back to that, I did because this would be going into an RPG game, and I wanted to just push this as far as I could. I sculpted even the inner sides of this, but I made it significantly lower in UV space because it wasn't as important as the rest, but I just still wanted to be there. Yeah, same when I was again with these nuts, and you wouldn't do anything like this in Attila, but if you know you have a detail that you will be sort of reusing, those two bolts are actually reusing the same UV space, so I make sure they are positioned in the UV in the first place, and then I create duplicates of them and place them around the mesh, so that you don't have to go back and trying to fiddle with all of them and try to fit them in the same UV space. But yeah. Yeah, I mean that works to an extent, but the problem is you can run into issues where again you've changed things too much, and in terms of the silhouette, right? To be perfectly honest, I think I've retopologized this manually as well because I wasn't really happy with the result that I had from Max that I brought in here to use as my base. And the place that I would the mesh that I would sculpt onto. So sometimes you just have to retopologize it. It all depends on whether it's rigged or not. If it's a static object, you can get away with quite crude topology. You can get away with triangles. All that matters at the case is how well you do the UV. And that's pretty much about it. And the silhouette, right? So just so you don't have any glaring sort of faces visible around the silhouette. In terms of the details that I sort of apply on this, that's definitely a mixture of both. I do like to use actually sort of render stuff out of Max. It's a little bit cheap, but it works. So what I do is let me open up the file and hopefully we'll be able to see it from there. This is kind of a tricky situation where I'm trying to apply patterns in Zbrush onto a curved surface, which is no easy task, and there is a specific workflow that I was documenting, and I never managed to get around to actually publish that, but hopefully I can just briefly cover it in here. Although then again, it's workflow specific to Zbrush, but for the patterns, let's see if it loads up eventually. So what I do is I replicate the pattern in 2D in my modeling tool, in this case 3ds Max. So I just go around and try to create a really rough cutout of the pattern, and then from there I give it a sort of subdivision or smooth, turbo smooth. So that way what I can do is I can just isolate this, and I can render it out, and because this is a geometry, it's not limited to pixels, because I can give it as many smoothing steps as I want. and then it's gonna it's gonna smooth it out for me, and I can render this at any resolution technically I want, so I'm not limited in that, and I can make adjustments to it pretty easily. So this way I can render the pattern and use it as an alpha mask. What I actually ended up doing for these is, because there is no way to actually apply this effective, and this is kind of a flat surface, so it is okay-ish, but try to create an alpha that is curved this way. It's gonna be a tough thing to do. So hopefully I'll be able to open up a file that shows how I did that. Actually, why don't I do it in a more practical example? One that I used for the Mouth of Sauron helmet, where I have the inscriptions. So I gathered the inscriptions in the same way that I did like the pattern, and I aligned them onto the mesh using all kinds of deform modifiers to just make it fit onto it. And then what you can do in Zbrush is you're gonna bring them both in, and they will let you mask out where those two geometries intersect, and they will create a mask out for you, and you can quickly use that to offset. So yeah, I do have that file. I do have the documentation or tutorial ready for that, but it's just I haven't gotten over to finishing it. But I probably will, because it's a really useful thing to do. Because applying these kind of patterns onto curved surfaces is doable in ZBrush as well, if you have a good UV, because you can shift onto you can create a UV for your high poly, and you can morph into the UV space, so it will project everything in 2D, and then you can apply your pattern in a 2D space like you would do on a texture, and you can then deform back into 3D. But it's just it's an extra step that requires a little bit more work, and it doesn't work all the time. So hopefully if I open this guy up, not sure if this will be there. So I don't know if this is still going to have the layer, because I saved it as a separate layer. No, I baked it already down, but I would have it would give me an intersection of the inscription mesh and the mesh underneath, and it would give me a mask that I can then invert and sort of inset in, and I would have it as a separate layer here in ZBrush, so I can control how far it extends. But yeah, to be perfectly honest, that's always a case-by-case situation. But I do recommend creating your own patterns and creating a library from them that you can sort of smack onto your textures or your models. Yeah, share it with the team. And remember, I had a collection of repeatable patterns that I would just drag out, and I would then give it with the rest of the team, and I think they ended up being used on a couple of assets. So that's definitely useful. Oh yeah, that's good to know. Those patterns were created for Rohan, or from Rohan reference, and I know I was just gathering them because I was creating the Rovanian units, and they were supposed to have some ancestry to the Rohan folk, so I just thought, why not? But I think that should be about it. So if you guys have any specific questions, feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to answer. Yeah. Where can you cut corners and where to focus most? What I tend to do, or what I used to do a bit too much actually, is gathering reference. I would be really obsessed with perfectionism in terms of like getting it right for proportions. So, for example, with the Gondor trebuchet, I've spent at least 50% of the project gathering reference for what it should look like, what the proportions should be like. In retrospect, you can just wing it. Like that, there is a point where you sort of are happy with the reference that you have, and you can just make up the rest. Where to cut corners? There are a lot of workflows nowadays that allow you to automate retopology and rigging and this kind of stuff. So the obviously the least artistic steps are being automated. And the most artistic steps are the ones where you set yourself apart, and that's where you cannot cut corners. So that, from my opinion, is your high poly sculpting and your texturing. With the introduction of procedural painters, so your Substance, your Quixels, your 3D coats, all of this stuff, anything that has procedural smart masks, smart materials, they are good as a base. They are interesting to sort of learn from, but they become incredibly repetitive, and you can really tell when someone's just slapped on a material and just kind of moved on. In most cases, I mean, the way these smart materials work, they always suck information from your baked maps, which means that if your sculpt does not have the information, the smart material will not do the magic properly. So I would definitely say try to get as much as you can out of your sculpt. Where you can cut corners with materials is create your own smart materials. That's kind of that's a little bit cliche to say, but I'm gonna say so for this, for the Mouth of Sauron, it took me a while to get this specific rusted metal that I wanted. I initially thought I could just get away with having a pretty smooth, clean high poly with just the inscription in there, and then do the rest of the damage effect and all this stuff with my material. It wouldn't really work. It would look way too clean and procedural. So in the end, I went back in and I really just sculpted all the damage in here around the edges, around the inscription, and then create a material from that. Once you have your own smart material, you can save that and reuse that on the rest of your assets. Again, I can share it with the team so that it maintains some consistency, but do try to stay away from just overall procedurally generated materials. Anything else? Yeah. Oh yeah. Don't worry about like feeling too bad about your work. The main thing is obviously always do something new. Like I said, when I was creating stuff for Rise of Mordor, I always did something new with my workflows and with the way I was approaching things. I think the biggest sort of change for me was with the Isengard units, where the first thing that I was doing was the actual armor, and I just created the model for the boot, I think, and I created the boots, the plates, the straps, and the clips. The clips in retrospect could just be a 2D plane, but I just wanted to push it further because in the end I could just collapse it down or bake it down if I wanted. But once I had the model ready, I would bring it into ZBrush and I would sculpt the detail on it in a specific way that I haven't done before, right? So I would just try to sculpt the edge damage to it, the way I would do scratches on it and this kind of stuff. I would then take it into my texturing package and I would do the texturing on this specific sort of part, and I would play around with the materials to get them right. So that way I have it ready and I know that when I go further with the rest of the set, so with the armor, helmets, all of this stuff, I will have a refined workflow for my sculpting, and I will have a quick time of actually using the materials that I created for this specific workflow. Like I still had to do quite a bit of hand painting for rust and all this kind of stuff that you could technically suck out of your ambient occlusion, but it just looks procedural. So I would end up hand painting it myself because it just, yeah, it takes time, but it does look better. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Just don't worry to try something new. Play around with other software. Yeah, if you need help with getting access to ZBrush or Marvelous, let me know. I can help you out with that. But it depends on how seriously you want to sort of take this. If it's something that you genuinely enjoy and it's something that you like to do down the line, again, I'm not in a gaming studio because I've sort of realized down the line that that's not really something, or I'm not sure if that's what I want to do personally. But I've still managed to find a career in this industry. But it means that you just have to try new things and you have to find out which things don't work and which workflows yield the best result in terms of time, resulting in quality. All right, let me. Oh yeah. All right, that's good to hear. Again, if you have any specific questions, try to DM me. Personally, I'm more likely to answer that rather than in the server itself, or if you ping me, then I'll do my best to respond. I'm glad the way that the mod is progressing. I saw the video yesterday with the Erebor units and elf units. All this is actually quite surprising. There were periods during the mod where we were sort of acquiring people, and it just and it wasn't going at the pace that we were hoping for. I think people like Maestro and Jogs, those folks, they really stay around and they push it. They push the team. Maestro is doing a good job of maintaining the team going. And Jogs is the absolute spine of this mod in terms of progress. So definitely kudos to those two folks. But yeah, I'm really happy with the way the mod is going, and I'm being genuinely optimistic with its completion. All right, well, it's cool. I was happy to help, and again, if you have any specific questions, do reach out. Again, just give a quick read to to the blog, where I sort of cover. It's always semi-advanced because I don't like to cover the basics because that's stuff that you can find online. But there is always, you know, questions about workflows and certain settings that you might miss. So the description is in the link of this video. So just click on that and you should find this. All right. So if that's all, I think we're gonna end it there and.